Righty-ho! In this video we're going to be looking at anxiety and depression and learning some really useful information that you may not have heard, learning new ways of perhaps looking at these symptoms or conditions. So one of the things that's first important to point out is that a lot of people classify anxiety as an emotion. And in Mikkel therapy, and even depression as well, classify depression as an emotion because we feel depressed. We say we feel depressed and we feel anxious. Now, Mikkel therapy looks at these two symptoms very differently and actually classifies them as symptoms. So the first important thing to understand is that these are symptoms. They're not emotions. They're not considered emotions in terms of the utilization of the techniques for clearing anxiety and depression. Very important to remember this. So if we remember that symptoms are loud emotions, right, then that means that these two also, that anxiety and depression are loud emotions. And that's why I'm going to explain in a minute. You see how I've written here, depression is depression. And what is happening actually with depression for most people is that they're depressing the emotions. So anxiety and depression become symptoms. And the way that we describe it in Mikkel therapy is we call it the anxiety pot, or anxiety and depression pot. So if you imagine that you have a big soup pot in your body, in your stomach area, and every time your body generates a primary emotion, anger, hurt, disappointment, grief, sadness, fear, boredom, loneliness, lack of joy, lack of fulfillment, all these primary emotions. Every time your body generates one of those emotions, which remember, primary emotions are generated spontaneously, automatically, before thought by the emotional brain centers. Whenever those emotions are generated, if we don't deal with the situation that has generated those emotions and we don't clear that emotional energy, it becomes symptoms. And what actually happens to that emotional energy inside the body is it gets stored inside the body. And it gets stored literally in the cells. And there's an article here that you can download, very interesting article that Dr. Mikkel wrote called Cellular Rewiring. So this energy is literally stored in the cells. And we're just using an analogy here of it going into a pot. So here we are, unconsciously we're putting these emotions in this pot. And slowly over time, and it does take time for this emotional energy to build up to become symptoms. It takes months and years. It's not an overnight thing because the body is very resilient. Over time though, this emotional energy, so remember everything is energy, it builds up in the cells. And then at some point when the pot looks like it's going to overflow, it's got full and it's about to overflow, unconsciously a part of us says, oh gosh, I don't want this emotional energy to overflow because that could look a bit messy. So remember, this is happening unconsciously. Unconsciously say, okay, I know what I'll do. I know how to fix this. I'm going to put a lid on it. So we put this lid, this energetic lid, on top of the pot. And for some people, not everybody, but certainly it was the case for me, for some people that will be experienced as depression. So in Mikkel therapy we say that depression is depressing emotions in the pot of emotions. Now you've also learnt by now that that energy needs to move, that emotions are, remember the emotions are emotion, and energy needs to move. That's what it does naturally. And so this energy, this emotional energy, tries to get out of the pot. It doesn't want to be there, right? It's not comfortable being there. And so it tries to get out under the lid like steam escaping. And that will be experienced as anxiety. So in mycotherapy we say that anxiety is one too many emotions in the pot of emotions. And in order to reduce either anxiety or depression, we're going to have to deal with the emotions in the pot, which basically means we need to deal with the situations that are creating those emotions. So say for example somebody has been living with a partner for 30 years and they have allowed themselves to be treated badly. And remember here, we're not saying, we're not making ourselves a victim, we're taking our part in it, we're taking responsibility for the role that we've played, because it takes two to tango, and we're finally recognizing and acknowledge without judging ourselves and beating ourselves up, okay, I've allowed this behavior to continue. And so we recognize that we've been putting up with this behavior for 30 years. Now 30 years is a long time. If you're being mistreated and put down and criticized and judged and whatever else might be considered unfair treatment, then that is a long time, because every time that happens the body will automatically generate a primary emotion in response to that treatment. So every time it happens, there may be a little bit of hurt that goes in there. There may be a bit of anger and frustration that goes in there, some disappointment, some sadness. It all goes in the pot. And it literally starts to fill our cellular energy up. Because remember, we are four parts to us: the physical, the emotional, the mental, spiritual. If you go back to that quantum physics video, it's all energy. So this emotional energy is filling up the energy of our body. Even though we think our cells are physical matter, at a quantum level they're little containers or spaces for containing energy. And so these spaces start to fill up with this emotional energy. And as you can imagine, over time that's going to have an effect, because whatever is happening energetically is going to have an impact physiologically. And that's why we end up with symptoms. So if that is going on for 30 years, that is going to build up quite a pot. And then somebody's going to find themselves seemingly out of nowhere, because they hadn't noticed what was going on emotionally beforehand, but all of a sudden they start to notice the anxiety or the depression. Now it's interesting that not everybody does exhibit depression. Most people will exhibit anxiety eventually. And that will, when that gets even more increased, if you like, if it's still not being dealt with, then that will become things like panic attacks, or it may become something like OCD. So it will become more advanced, if you like. So initially we may start to feel really depressed, and most people think, oh, I'm just really depressed, I'm really unhappy. Well, yes, you are really depressed and unhappy, because there's all that frustration and sadness and grief and whatever else in the pot. No wonder you feel depressed. And the interesting thing with depression, which I discovered for myself because I had clinical depression for many years, I was diagnosed with clinical depression, hospitalized with clinical depression, very, very bad depression for many years. And so I've really been through the mill on this one and really know what it feels like to experience that. Is that when we depress these emotions, not only are we depressing the uncomfortable emotions, like the hurt, the frustration, the sadness, etc., we also depress the good feeling emotions. So we'll depress the happiness and the contentment and the joy, and everything just gets depressed. And this is what creates enormous fatigue and other symptoms. But the interesting thing about this is energy. We've got to remember that we're dealing with energy here, and it takes a lot of energy to hold this energy in the pot. It takes a lot of energy to keep that lid on the pot. So it's a bit like holding a basketball underwater. You have to keep holding it underwater for it to stay there. And if you don't, then boof, it just pops up to the surface. So we depress both the good, inverted commas, and the not good emotional energy, and we feel depressed as a result of that. And then we also experience anxiety because all this emotional energy is bubbling away underneath the lid in the pot, wanting to come out. So I just want to say, please don't get worried that all of a sudden, oh my God, all this energy from years and years is going to all, explode out like a volcano. It doesn't tend to work like that, although occasionally we can sort of let little bits out. But what is really fantastic about the body, in my experience, is that it is highly intelligent and it will never give us more than we can deal with. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes it may not feel like it's giving us more than we can deal with emotionally. But in my experience, it never gives us more than we can deal with at any one time, which is like, again, part of the safety mechanism. So everything is around safety for the body. So keeping us safe in our environment, keeping us safe as we recover our health. So this is very important to remember, that anxiety and depression are symptoms, which means that when you're doing your mycotherapy techniques, if you're identifying anxiety and depression, you need to ask yourself, what am I really feeling? Okay, they're going to be these primary emotions underneath these symptoms. Very important to keep reminding yourself of that. And there will be emotions underneath. It wasn't until I started learning the techniques that I started learning for identifying and clearing emotional energy that I came to understand that that underneath depression were other emotions. And for me, and for most people, sadness and grief and fear and frustration are some of the key emotions that tend to lie underneath depression. But could be any emotion according to each person. So I hope that's been helpful, and look forward to speaking again in the next video.